Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to Reframing Nonprofit Leadership Succession, the ultimate strategic hedge against a bad CEO hire. NPQ is proud to present this groundbreaking webinar featuring two of the nonprofit sector's most well-known experts on executive transition, Jean Bell of Compass Point and Tom Adams of RAFA PC. This session is unusual in two different ways. First, it's scheduled for an hour and a half rather than an hour to allow you all to ask as many questions as you like. And second, it's tailored around the needs, particularly of consultants and funders, although I think other people will definitely get what they need out of the session. Now on with the show. Before we begin, I want to emphasize that this topic should be of utmost importance to nonprofits and their funders. The risks involved in doing business the way we always have in terms of leadership transitions are significant. To illustrate that point, I have this description of a now outdated process from one of our attendees today. This is what she wrote. As a former board chair of a medium-sized organization, about $5 million, I had to lead the process of executive transition of the CEO who had served the organization for 21 years. It was a challenging task. The executive had become somewhat autocratic in her leadership style, and silos were entrenched within the organization. New ideas and ways were stalled and sometimes derailed. While the organization had grown under her leadership, somewhere along the way it stalled, and even with resources and support from the board, we could not get the CEO to embrace new ways of thinking nor embrace the changes happening within the community and the sector. Ultimately, we negotiated the CEO out. However, she was resistant to change and the exit was difficult. The organization did go through a period of uncertainty, and while we did notify the major funders and ask the COO to serve as an interim, it took us nearly a year to find our next CEO. How do you, as an executive board, make difficult transitions happen more smoothly when the CEO will not cooperate, but you still need to change and want to be as fair as you can to the outgoing CEO and to the organization? I think this is one out of many scenarios that could be presented that really illustrate the fact that when you are doing an executive transition, a leadership transition, depending on the switch from one individual to another, you may be taking yourself down a troublesome road. In the past, nonprofit executive transitions have been hampered by a set of limiting assumptions that treat the leader like a standalone, all-important organizational component. The most ceremonial act of choosing the new organizational hero has over and over again resulted in any number of problems that can negatively destabilize the work of nonprofits. In fact, the problem of bad nonprofit leadership hires may not be in the implementation, but in the frame or ethos of the practice. Today, Tom and Jean will present the new framework for a less risky and more robust leadership transition process. They will be joined today by several illustrious panelists whom Jean will introduce in a moment. This webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be shared with all attendees shortly after the meeting, so don't keep asking us that question. You can ask us other questions. So we will make the recording also freely available on our website so that anyone can download later. We'll leave time for questions at the end, so if you think of any, go ahead and use the questions panel, which is at the right-hand side of your screen, and you can ask those questions anytime they occur to you. You don't have to ask them at the end. So if you feel like you're left, even after someone's spoken, with a question that's been unanswered, go ahead and log it in, and I'll keep track of them and feed them to the presenters later. Finally, we are on social media. You can follow today's conversation with #SmartTransition. That's on the right-hand side of your screen where it says join the conversation, share what you've learned. Feel free to post questions and comments during and after our presentation on Twitter as well. And with that, I want to introduce Jean Bell, who's the Chief Executive Officer at Compass Point, and Tom Adams, who is a Director in the Sustainability, Succession, and Transition Planning process for RAFA PC. Thank you and welcome, Jean and Tom.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Appreciate it so much and appreciate your support of this work. This is actually our third webinar this year on this topic, and we're excited to share it with you and to have so many guest speakers and panelists. Let me just first introduce how this is going to work. Ruth mentioned that we have 90 minutes together, and that's because we have two very rich stories that raise a lot of issues and show us some really good examples of thoughtful board and executive partnership around transition. So we're going to start with Tom and I offering a premise for this work, a sort of a refresh and a reframe, as Ruth discussed. Then we're going to do the Children's Inn case study and hear from their executive and a couple of board members. And then we're going to do a second case study with Management Assistance Group, MAG. And then we have the fourth part of our five-part conversation is a response panel from consultants and funders, reflecting on what those case studies bring up for them about their support and investment in nonprofits going through transition. And then Ruth is going to moderate Q&A, and we'll share a set of resources with you that we've developed over the course of this project, Tom and I. So that's how we're going to be organized. And just let me know if I should stop at any point or continue. Should I keep going, Ruth?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the first part is the premise, slide 3. And we can go to slide 4 now. And this is work that, Compass Point and Tom Adams have been involved in executive transition work for over 2 decades. And Tom in particular, I think most people on the call probably know, is a leading practitioner and field leader. And we got together over a year ago now to think about the state of the executive transition management field and how it fit into the larger conversation about organizational change and leadership change. And as I said, we did some writing together, a lot of reflection on our own practices, but also a lot of engagement with fellow practitioners. And it led us to want to offer the field this idea that leadership transitions are essential, they're critical, they're huge opportunity moments, right? And they're complex processes in and of themselves. And yet they are also very much connected to and sometimes catalyzed or influenced by organizational transitions. And by that we mean what we see so widespread across the sector, organizations grappling with demographic shifts, political shifts, business model shifts, needing to rethink their theories of change, sort of coming to cycles of innovation, right? Where there's a lot of organizational transition work, which is both strategic, but also adapting organizational culture and systems in concert. So hard work that, again, is often connected to or can be catalyzed by leadership transitions. We're focusing today a lot on executive transition, but you're going to hear that it's also transitions around board as well and other senior staff positions. So we're positing that these leadership transitions and organizational transitions, we benefit from thinking of them more holistically. And then I think we actually have to add another layer, which is that in the 25 years since executive transition management process in the nonprofit sector really took root and became a discipline, our thinking about leadership itself has evolved a lot. And Tom and I decided to call that the evolving leadership ethos, that outer circle in which we experience many organizations challenging themselves about who leads, who's considered a leader, and then what type of leadership beliefs and practices they're bringing to bear in an organization or in a network or movement. So when you widen it out that broadly, it becomes a pretty complex set of conversations, and certainly leadership transitions are at the center. But we think that it's a mistake for organizations and boards to only deal with, as Ruth mentioned in the beginning, sort of preparing for individual succession, when they have to be thinking about the leadership needs given organizational transitions, and they also want to be thinking about what kind of leadership is best suited to their mission and their organization, both in terms of values and impact. So that's the frame that we're offering today. And I want to turn it to Tom now to talk a little bit about those first 2 circles and just ground us in some definitions, and then I'll come back on the leadership ethos. If you could advance the slide, please.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Ruth. It's a pleasure to be here today. you know, this is really a good news presentation. We have a great opportunity for the sector. 20 years ago, boards, executives, funders were often traumatized by executive transition. You know, particularly if you had a long tenured executive or a founder, you just kind of held your breath and hoped for the best. Today, there's a whole set of practices to support that transition. No guarantees that it's going to be perfect every time, but a lot greater odds that you can have success, as the case studies we're going to talk about today demonstrate. And there are a lot of resources that are available to boards and executives and funders and consultants to learn about the practice of executive transition. Many of the national foundations, many of the funders on the call today have helped to generate and build that practice around executive transition. And the opportunity really is to think about leadership in a broader context, as Jean has indicated. And really, it's a paradigm shift. You know, if you think about the ultimate goal of any nonprofits, it's to deliver mission results. We all want to have our organization humming. Many of us have had the privilege of being around an organization when it's humming, and many of us have had the misfortune of being around one when it's not. And the difference between humming and not is attention to leadership, strategy, and the systems that support leadership and strategy. And so what we want to talk about today is how we learn from executive transition to go deeper, and how we want to encourage that funders and consultants to think about this not as an option, but really as part of best practice or promising practice, however you want to describe it. That succession planning today is still thought about as a luxury. Most leaders think that the basic job is to keep the lights on, keep the money coming in, keep whatever business we're in, services delivered, and that really is an awesome and amazing job. Unfortunately, that is like in the entrepreneurial myth, the entrepreneur who can only make as many donuts as she could do herself, and we're limited in production. And so to really make the investment in the connection between leadership and organizational transition and leadership ethos allows us to really leverage mission results and to strengthen the organization for the long haul. And so the new practices that have evolved, we're taking private sector succession planning and adapting it to nonprofits. There's a check the box method of this, which is getting an emergency backup plan off the internet and saying, yes, we have one, or a succession policy. And then there's a deeper dive, which is really looking at unpacking the jobs and the competencies required to really have the organization hum, and look at bench strength and backup for those positions, and really look at how are we doing in terms of developing a inclusive and diverse workforce here? How are we proactively working for that? So succession planning can be a rich and deep part of ongoing work. The recession of 2008-2009 drove us to a deeper look at sustainability. Jean and her colleagues had done the first work on this around connecting financial sustainability with mission results. Some of us then took that a little further and said, organizational sustainability is about more than money. It's really about leadership, strategy and business model, culture, and resources. And we found that in terms of integrating this, particularly with founders and long tenured executives and with complex transitions, looking at succession and sustainability before the transition makes the transition go a whole lot more smoothly. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the case study. Next slide. So the key terms we'll be talking about today, just to kind of review them quickly for you: executive transition and search. And the key word there is transition and search. For a lot of board leaders, the focus is on the person, on the hero leader, and on the search. And no matter how effective that person is, if the transition issues aren't identified and attended to, there are great risks that that transition is not going to go successfully. So we need to pay attention to both the transition and the search. As I mentioned, succession planning involves some basics of emergency plans and succession policies. But it's not about finding necessarily the one person. It's about a culture of leader development that really invests in the team, invests in the bench, and figures out how do we use the talent we have and the talent we can acquire to get our mission most effectively delivered. Part of succession planning sometimes ends up in transitions requiring an intentional interim. There's a whole pool of talent around the country of people that have dedicated themselves to learning how to be effective interim executives. Just think about the power if they were trained in how to really advance organizational sustainability and diversity and inclusiveness, and every interim paid attention to that. What a difference it would make in the kind of leadership changes we have. And so we have an enormous amount of potential, but all these practices have been developed in boxes and silos by particular funders and narrow sets, developed by consultants who are very good at one or two of the skills. And so collaboration is really what's required to move us forward. If we don't collaborate, then we stay in our boxes and silos, and the sector doesn't get the benefit. The same is true with sustainability planning and that look at long-term mission capacity. And strategic planning is kind of getting beaten around a little bit of being, it's hard to plan for very far in the future. And so how do we blend strategic and sustainability planning so that it informs a kind of leadership and really has a human capital and a leadership ethos discussion with it? Next slide.
Thanks, Tom. So I'm going to pick up on the outer bubble now and just offer a little bit of language around the leadership ethos. Again, we're using this word ethos defined in the upper left corner here as the fundamental character or spirit of a culture, the underlying sentiment that informs the beliefs, the customs, or practices. And we mean that. We mean that, I've been in leadership development for 20 years, 10 years as an executive, and we're in a very different conversation about leadership than we were 20 years ago, that's for sure. We've moved through the phases of nonprofits are little businesses. We have a big talent shortage, and we need talent from the for-profit sector desperately. That we need to adapt all the traditional business norms to be successful nonprofits. And, it's not that there aren't great lessons learned in the for-profit sector, but I think we're way past that conversation. And many of us are at a place of seeing the nonprofit sector actually as a very special seat of leadership development, and that people can develop amazing skills and careers right here in our sector. They don't need to go somewhere else to learn them and then come back, right? And so what are some of the things that people are experimenting with and really wanting for nonprofit leadership specifically? And some of those things I think are clear they're on the right. A lot of us are exploring shared leadership. And again, it's not to say that that's not happening in the for-profit sector, but we have our own cultures and intended impacts in the nonprofit sector. So what do we mean by shared leadership? How do we get away from that hero leader, very traditional vertical ascension model of leadership development? And many of us are working very hard around issues of diversity, but also wanting to go further than diversity to developing new practices that actually produce equity, that actually distribute resources and opportunity fairly inside nonprofits and across fields and movements. And this is hard work. And for many organizations, it's fairly new work to really take a hard look at their internal practices and whether they are living out their values with respect to leadership and leadership development. The quote in the bottom left is actually from a MAG piece, our second case study, and they do a lot of work around networked leadership in a social justice context and talk about some of those qualities in the bottom there that are going to require new forms of leadership. So that's to say, hopefully this resonates. For many of us, we're thinking about not just who leads, who should lead, but how they should lead, how they should share leadership, what kinds of practices they're going to implement in organizations so that those organizations better reflect their values and their intended impact in the world. So let me take it now back to Tom, next slide, to introduce our first case study, which is Children's Inn.
Thanks, Jean. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce three of the leaders of the Children's Inn at NIH, which is in Washington, D.C., and they'll explain a little bit about what that organization is in a minute. Jenny Luca is the CEO at the Children's Inn, and we'll be talking about her transition to that role. Kelvin Womack is a former board chair and a board member and was very active in the transition committee. And Holly Cobb Parker, who was a founding board member and was on the transition committee and has been involved in every aspect of the the organization and leadership transitions here. So I'm delighted to introduce the panel and to share with you their story of how these three ideas of leadership and organizational transition and leadership ethos kind of came together for them. Next slide, please. So I'm going to just quickly summarize what we're going to talk about in more detail, and Jenny and Holly and Kelvin will fill in the details. The first, on the far left of the screen, you can see the founding board member, Kathy Russell, became the CEO in 2005. She was a founding board member when the Inn was founded in 1990. So she was on the board for 15 years prior to becoming the CEO. She became CEO because the organization had been through a couple executive transitions that didn't go so well, and there was some conflict in the staff, and the board wanted somebody to unify and bring the organization together. So you're going to hear a successful case study here, but if you think back, if you think about transitions as like a chain or a necklace, each link either strengthens or weakens it. And so had that transition gone poorly, we would not be sitting here thinking about the success that's happened over the last 10 years or will be happening over the next 5 or 10 years. So each transition is a pivotal moment. And so Kathy became the executive. You'll note that on this chart, nothing happens between 2005 to 2012 because Kathy's building the organization with the board. These organizations don't get built overnight, and so successfully did that. 2012, after she'd been there 7 years, she began talking with the board about reorganizing. And Holly's going to talk a little bit about that in more detail in a few minutes. In 2013, she was beginning to think about her own end game. And so she began to engage in a number of ways with the organization that we'll be talking about. And one was to set up a succession and sustainability task force and to look at the management team, how it ought to be organized, and how to lead the organization forward. That resulted in creating 3 chief positions for the organization, one of which was filled by Jenny Luca, who eventually became the CEO. And we'll talk more about her preparation in that part of the transition. The board reorganization from a founder board of 40-some members was a very careful and well thought out process. And so it became formally adopted in 2014 after a couple of years of discussion. The transition got formal in 2014 also, and in 2015 a decision was made, and the beginning of 2015 Jenny began as the CEO. And as Jenny took over and was working with Kelvin as board chair and with other board members, there was a commitment made to a board diversity initiative, which we'll also talk about. So clearly, leadership ethos, organizational transition, leadership transition have been blended together over the last 5 years or so for the Inn, and resulting in a very thoughtful process. Next slide. Holly, do you want to just talk a little bit about the kind of that 10-year process from your point of view, from kind of Kathy's coming to the transition?
Well, it was a very busy period, as you can see from the timeline. But I think the processes that we used in terms of task forces for the change we needed to do in the board and also the change that we were doing for the CEO were very tied in together. And we used some similar, I think, methods and ways to do things to reach our decisions and then ultimately to implement the plan.
And Jenny, you joined the Inn sort of with some aspirations to be an executive someday when you came, and tell us a little bit about your career path and kind of working with Kathy and just how you got to be where you are today.
Sure, and thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I should say a couple words about what the Children's Inn is, and then I can and then share a little bit about myself for our listeners. The Inn is a nonprofit organization located in Bethesda, Maryland, and our mission is to provide lodging and support services for seriously ill children and their families who travel from all over the world and all over the United States to participate in medical research trials at the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. And that's basically the world's biggest research hospital doing medical research. So these are kiddos who are very sick, who have exhausted most of their options and are really here hoping for a new treatment or a cure. And so I've been with DN for about 14 years. I was hired in 2003 to lead all of the programs and services for our families. And I was lucky enough to work under Kathy Russell, who really held high the value of leadership development and really developing all employees who are working in an organization. So way before we talked about her retirement or even my own career aspirations, we talked about the skills that I needed to be developing to be successful in the job that I had. And as she started to think about her own retirement, she started to very, I guess, informally work with several of us to develop the skills that would be needed to eventually be a CEO. And as the years went by, she and I got a little bit more specific about my own career aspirations, which certainly were to either lead the Children's Inn one day or perhaps lead another organization similar to the Children's Inn. And it was at that point that we got very serious about my own skill development and aligned it with for future retirement. That didn't mean that I was certainly going to be selected to be the CEO, but it meant that I would be set up either here or to go someplace else.
Great. Kelvin, as you watched that process, what would you say about that?
Well, I think it was a beautiful thing that Kathy put us in a great position. She developed her successor, and having been involved in these types of processes in my regular day job, that is a gift that we had for the end. And we'll talk more later about how the board deliberated on the decision of selecting Jenny as our CEO, because it wasn't a slam dunk, even though we're in a great position. But I can't say enough about the fact that we had a CEO who was very intentional about developing her successor base. And as Jenny, I think, alluded to, it wasn't just Jenny, she developed people. And Jenny happened to be the person that we chose to be our CEO.
Next slide, please. So Holly, you've had the privilege of being a founding board member and seeing the inn evolve. It must be very exciting and gratifying. Tell us about the decision to reorganize the board and kind of some of the early work on the search and sort of your thinking about that.
Well, as Tom mentioned before, we had a very large board, up to 34 members before we started to think about the transition. It was a board that was heavily weighted towards founders, people who developed this organization, and even those who had been on the board for 10 to 15 years. We were operationally oriented in most cases with only partial ability to do fundraising. And we were at a period in the organization's history where we had reached what I call the adulthood in the organization, and we were looking towards how to sustain the organization for the next 25 years and what the board would look like. And that is what started us on a path. And we had a portion of our board, because we were so large, who was quite frankly not active, and that created a lot of work for the staff in terms of trying to bring them on, and we needed to do something different. And I would say the culture of our board was very much before the transition, and I think that's one of the things that has carried over, very, very family-like. We reached decisions by consensus, and it was a group that very much enjoyed working with each other, and I think that has held through the change. Our board reorganization plan that we were tasked with developing really changed the board significantly. We cut the size in half. We implemented term limits, which we had never had in the history of our board, and we also implemented a give-get that would guide giving policy for the board so that we would have 100%. And in terms of looking for the expectations that of a search consultant for our CEO organization, we did work with one we had when we entered the CEO search process, I think we had two very different schools of thought. One was there's a certain way that you do a CEO search. It is a national-based search, and to do less than that is really a disservice to our organization. And then we had another group on the board who very much felt like an internal placement was what we needed, that it was in the best interest of the organization. It gave us history and consistency, and sent a powerful message to our staff and to everyone who's involved in the board. And I would think the role of a consultant, which we used in the CEO process, but not the board reorganization process, was really a sounding board for all of the different parties, a non-partial opinion at times, which we all needed, and certainly a reminder of what best practices were and what were the things that we really needed to consider if we were not going to take the standard approach and do a national search.
Great. Next slide, please. Kelvin, you want to pick up on that and just share a little bit from your perspective on the committee, some of those discussions?
Yeah, so I think this is a very, very important discussion because, quite frankly, as I mentioned earlier, we had the gift of having someone that had been developed and prepared to be our CEO. But at the same time, we're also about to lose a founder of the Children's Inn, a woman who had been chairman of our board, and a person with immense experiences. We knew we had some big shoes to fill. And so even though we all had great confidence in Jenny, I felt that we needed a debate. We just needed to air the discussion, as Holly mentioned about, are there some folks out there that we should at least consider? We should at least have a competitive. We have a fiduciary responsibility as a board to have a process. After all, it just couldn't be that easy. That we already had our CEO sitting there with us, no matter how good we all knew Jenny was. So we had that conversation, and I think it after all was said and done, it boiled down to the risk of us actually going through that process, because we did have a person that we all had a lot of confidence in. What if we open it up to competition? What would we send? What message would we send to our team here at the Children's Inn? What message would we send to Jenny? What message would we send to all the staff that was with us that had great confidence in Jenny as we did? What message would that send? So we finally, I think, came to the conclusion that the risk of going through a process where we all were pretty confident of what the outcome was going to be anyway, the risk of doing that would send too many ripples through the organization that we just did not need. And so a lot of that is what caused us to say, listen, let's not go through this. We already know the answer. We don't need to do that. We have this gift of someone that's been prepared. And so that's what we did. I will say that after the decision was made and soon after Jenny took over, it was very, very clear that not only did we have a continuation of a great culture and a great leader in our footsteps, but one of the things that we talked about that we really didn't know that how much we were going to get this in Jenny is a person also came with a vision, a person that had an idea of how we're going to perpetuate the great culture and the things that the Inn had done over the 20-something years we had been in existence. But we also had a person that came on with a vision of how we could evolve ourselves. So I think that's very, very important. I don't think that we would have gotten that had we gone outside. This came with someone that knew the Inn, knew the staff, knew our board, knew our patients and our customers, and knew the NIH. And finally, throughout all of this, we did, at some point, decide as a board that as we went through this process, we took a hard look at the diversity of thought that we had as a board and the value of that, and were we missing something, and making sure that when we looked at our board, we continued to inject that diversity of thought. One of the things that we got with Jenny was not only fresh thought, but we were also in the process of making sure we looked at the fact that we had a lot of founders on our board, people that had been around a long time, and quite frankly, we need to refresh our board with some younger members and also some more racially diverse members. So we, soon after Jenny took over, we decided this is something that we really need to focus on, and we're in the process of doing that right now with the diversity task force.
Just to add, so as an observer of the process, that, and I've seen a number of boards, there are a lot of ways to do consider internal succession. And I think the seriousness of the vetting of Jenny, the fact that she was interviewed by all the managers, there were in-depth reference checks done with external stakeholders. There were 2 opportunities for any board member not on the committee to come in and meet with Jenny. And there was 2 in-depth interviews by the committee itself. All that, each one of those, just observing it, seemed to give more confidence to the decision. And Jenny knew up front that could have gone the other way. Each one of those could have brought less confidence to it, and they could have decided to go the other way. So Jenny, as I hand it off to you and we go to the next slide, talk a little bit about how that felt to you, being a candidate kind of at risk.
Yeah, I understood the risk, and I understood also the deliberations of the board. I've been with the organization for 12 years, I guess, at that point, and had been through one transition already. So inherently, I understood that this was very important. And I think one of the biggest risks of all was that, and Kelvin touched on it, was that they were coming from a very seasoned CEO, someone who had a lot of executive experience, and I was going to be a brand new CEO with an organization that is fairly high profile in our area. So I think together we all wanted to know that I was ready for that. And it wasn't just about me, though. It meant that the board was going to have to evolve in a really different way, that every single person on that board was going to have to also perhaps increase their leadership to support not only a new employee, a new CEO, but a first-time experienced CEO. So that was interesting. I also, and just one more point of being an internal candidate, and I think sometimes an organization, the time is right to have an internal candidate. Sometimes the time is right to have an external candidate. But one of the, something I learned during being an internal candidate also is that I think sometimes there's a myth that if you have an internal candidate, you're just going to get more of the same, that if I was mentored under my predecessor, that I would bring forward her ideas and her thoughts and her vision. And that's actually turned out to be, and she knew that. She convinced us all that's not true. It's different leader, different time. I brought an entirely different skill set, entirely different ideas and views that I had the benefit of developing after being with the organization for 14 years. And then once I was brought into the role, I was able to just hit the ground running because I knew the organization, I knew the people, I knew the relationships. So for our particular organization, the timing of it, I think, was right for me to be promoted.
Briefly on some of the leadership ethos issues that bubbled up through this process.
Sure. So we did exactly what you touched on earlier, Tom, which I think was such a great benefit to me and set me up for success. And that is this board with Holly and Kelvin leading this process, put the time and the resource in and planning into this transition. So this was a year and a half probably of many discussions and planning, and during the budgeting process, setting aside resources to make sure that we were able to really implement the transition in the right way. So one of the first steps of the process was looking at the capacity within each of the departments of the organization and unpacking the jobs just as you suggested, and thinking, do we have the right person in the right job? Do we need a different person? Do we need a different skill set? And for us, that uncovered some inefficiencies in our organization, some departments where we did not have enough bench strength, and if we had transitioned at the wrong time, could have really set the new CEO up for trouble. But so we made sure prior to Kathy formally announcing her retirement, that we had the right people in place. And so some of that was reorganizing at the executive level. At the time, several of us in the organization had our span of control was far too large, including the CEO. So we reorganized at the top, and we also reorganized really at all aspects of the organization. So I think the time and the planning and making sure the culture is is ready for a transition like this is so important, and we've certainly seen the benefits of that.
Right. So while we might not have called it leadership ethos work at the time, you built out a trustee board for yourself. You figured out how to share leadership with the staff in new ways, created a culture that really supports both you and the organization. Next slide, please. So in wrapping up, I'm going to ask each of our distinguished panelists just to kind of give a closing thought to our participants. But so the things that got done there are obviously a major reorganization and transition from a founder, both of the board and the leadership, a generational handoff in the board that, and really at the staff level that really has served the organization well, and a growing attention to both leader development culture and diversity and inclusion. So, Kelvin, why don't we start with you? What kind of last words would you like to leave with our participants today?
We made the right decision, I think is the most important thing. And I was very, very proud of our process and our board and the fact, quite frankly, that we had a consultant that helped us get experience from the outside and helped us check our thinking and our debate at the door. I think the entire process and the teaming there made a huge difference in the outcome that we had. And I can't stress enough something we talked about earlier. We knew that we had a great organization and culture here that we wanted to continue on into the future, but at the same time, we also want to evolve and improve. And we got both of those with the selection of Jenny.
I think just the thought to develop your own process that meets your organization's needs at the time in its life cycle, and don't be afraid to go outside of the box and plan enough time so that the organization can make the right decision. Don't rush these things.
Okay.
Yeah, and my takeaway is transparency. That because Kathy and the board was so transparent along the way, both with me and the entire staff, and even some of our stakeholders, at the appropriate time communicating the transition. By the time we got to selecting me for the position, even on my first day, there were no surprises. And I think that was really key. Everybody felt as though they had a voice in the process. And so I think that's something to remember. I think sometimes leadership transition can feel like you need to be very secretive about it and what's going on at the top and who's making those decisions. But the transparency was key. And one other thought is it did not stop on my first day. Tom, you were our consultant. And I think one of the gifts you gave to us on the board is to remind us to make sure that we held some time in my first year also and really continued to call it the transition. So you stuck with me, the board stuck with me, that search and transition committee turned into what was called an onboarding committee. And Kelvin, who was the board chair at the time, allowed us all to make the transition the priority. And so there was some other priorities that were competing, but it was him and the board that said, let's wait. This is 6 months. It's the most important thing we can do. And that gave me the time to really start to think about what I was going to do as CEO. The time and planning.
Thank you all very much. And the next slide, and back to you, Jean.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you all at Children's Inn for sharing your story. I want to invite Gail to join me online here. Hi, Gail. Gail Williams is a board member of MAG, Management Assistance Group. And I'm hearing some bad sound. Anya, are you?
How do we mute?
Yeah, I think Children's Inn just needs to make sure they mute themselves.
Okay, sounds good now? Yeah. Okay. Welcome, Gail. And Gail and I are going to share the story of Management Assistance Group, a very different mission, nonprofit. They do leadership development and network development with organizations committed to social change. And Gail has a long history with the organization, but I also want to say that Gail's also worked in philanthropy and as a practitioner and as an interim executive. So you're bringing a lot of different perspectives to this story. Welcome.
Thank you.
Next slide, please. So MAG is a different timeline, but you'll notice some similarities in the sense that we are dealing with a very blended process of organizational transition, leadership transition, and ultimately experimenting with a different leadership ethos and structure. So I'll just briefly point out that in the very beginning here, you'll see in 2008, this is before our story, the two people that couldn't have predicted then that they would become the co-directors of MAG in 2015 were actually people who were doing work around shared leadership models with other organizations and were students of different leadership practices. But the story that Gail's going to share with us really begins when their board and staff decided that MAG was going to really kind of reimagine itself. It was doing that kind of theory of change revision that I mentioned earlier. And right around that same time, their executive at the time, also just for her own personal reasons, stepped down. And so you had this interplay of organizational transition and leadership transition. This is an organization too that probably most people assumed at the board level would go external, or at least do an external search. And here too, a proposal came in internal. It was a very different story around a shared leadership proposal that ultimately emerged. But Gail was also served as the interim executive, and so she can share how she supported both the staff and the board through this process. So let's get into the story. Next slide. So Gail, why don't you start with telling us a little bit about the organizational transition? How would you frame it? What was emerging there, and what kind of support you were getting as you bled into the executive departure?
Okay. Well, MAG is a 30-some-year-old organization, and in 2014, the work of the organization was a nonprofit consulting firm. And around 2014, both the board and the staff began having conversations about the insufficiency of only being a consulting firm in contributing to the change that we wanted to see in the world and that MAG's clients were working towards. So we were asking ourselves on the board and on the staff leadership around, there was a sense that MAG could have a larger contribution beyond consulting. So we started imagining what we began to call MAG 2.0. And that is where we have evolved over time. To support us in that process, we hired a consultant who brought to us design thinking. And he helped us come up with a new strategy and business plan. And he, throughout this executive transition, along with the organizational transition, he modeled for us a kind of leadership that modeled risk-taking, experimenting, assessing risk, and building upon what we learn along the way. So in 2014, the executive director exited, and I stepped in as the interim executive director to give the board and the staff time to figure out all these transitions that were happening all at once. Our agreement was that I would be in that interim role for 6 months. It turned out to be about 8 months. And then the story continues.
Sorry, I'm not sure that the slide got advanced a little quickly there. Are you ready to advance?
I am, if you are.
Okay, okay, that was unintentional. So this is the right slide now.
So the expectation, the board entered into the search for a new executive director with an expectation of an external search. And the main reason for that is that the board was uncertain whether the current staff could separate enough from MAG's current culture and way of being to lead the kind of significant change that we were anticipating. Because we truly were looking at deep change in the culture. I love the term ethos goes deeper than culture. because we were identifying aspects and characteristics in the spirit of MAG's culture that we felt needed to change in order for MAG to live into the 2.0 we were envisioning. So we were just uncertain as a board whether the current staff was so ingrained in a very strong organizational culture, and very positive for the most part, organizational culture, to lead the kind of change we were all imagining. So in the process of these conversations among the board and between board and staff, the staff came up with a proposal for internal shared leadership. And the shared leadership would be between two existing staff members who had worked together on shared leadership in the past at 2008 point in the timeline, but had never been in executive director roles. And their proposal came from staff conversations and centered on 3 points of rationale. One was that MAG is an earned income organization, and that as such, we couldn't afford to pay a new executive director who would not carry a strong consulting role to generate earned income. We couldn't pay that person to get up to speed, because as an earned income organization, we didn't have that luxury. Was their rationale number one. Number two was they looked among the staff and said, who can do this executive role internally? And they came up with the current two co-executive directors because of their interest in shared leadership and their complementary skill base. And then finally, their argument to the board was, hey, this is an opportunity for MAG to practice what it preaches about shared leadership and about equity. So the board was still thinking that we needed an external search because we weren't totally confident that the current staff could make this significant culture and ethos transition. And the staff was coming forward with this proposal. And we were at a board meeting, and there was this pivotal moment where there was a fishbowl of the board and staff, and our consultant was the one who suggested that we do this because he felt that we weren't fully hearing each other. Mm-hmm. And so he put the staff in the middle of the fishbowl first, and they talked about why the shared leadership with two existing staff members was the way to go. Then he put the board in the middle of the fishbowl, and we talked about why we were concerned about it and why it might not work. And his role was to help us really deeply listen to each other, and because of his background in design thinking, to help us think about how we would manage risk, to help us really identify what the risk was, and then to help us think through how we would manage that risk. And I think one of the significant things that happened in that conversation was when we decided to go the internal candidates shared leadership, we had an explicit conversation about we're all in this together. And so that set up a culture of support for the new co-executive directors that becomes extremely important as this story evolves.
Great. I'm going to move us to the next slide if I can, and ask you to share a little, because for many of us, we've heard a lot about shared leadership, but you've actually experienced selecting internal co-directors and getting to comfort and getting to that we're all in this together. So we just have only about 3 more minutes for us here, Gail, so I want to give it all to you and take it away on how you set up that experiment and how you measured success and what you've learned.
Well, we set up the experiments based on this confluence of the organizational change that we were looking for and supporting the new co-executive directors. And so the benchmarks were structured around a fundamental question of, can we transition MAG from an earned income organization to an organization that works in collaboration with others in advancing dignity, love, and justice. So it was a big organizational question. And we agreed that we were going to bet the store on that. And this was a board and staff agreement. We were betting the store that we could do this. And if we couldn't, we'd go out of business, or make a significant adjustment along the way. And so we set up a series of experiments there. Then with the setting up the experiments and benchmarks with the co-directors, the experiments were around, could they carve out the time that they would need to work together to build trust, to build their relationship, to deal with conflicts that might come up? Could they create a division of responsibilities so that it was clear to everybody, including the staff and external partners, about who was doing what? So they were the kinds of experiments we set up. The leadership structure, a compelling part of all of this for us was the link between co-director, shared leadership, and MAG's mission impact. Because we have seen the effects of this, and we've grown from 5 staff to 12 staff, from $1 million budget to a 1.5 million. So it's working. Just a couple of minutes about a couple of things about the lessons we learned about co-directorship. I think Alyssa and Susan's pre-existing relationship is really important. And one of the things they did was to interview other co-directors, and that was a constant theme that they heard in shared leadership, is that the people sharing leadership, it's extremely helpful if they have a pre-existing relationship and begin to build trust from there. Another lesson that we learned was the importance of activating this culture of support by having a consultant like the consultant who helped us help us identify the benchmarks and how to assess them for the risk that we were taking, so everybody was clear and we were in that together. We provided coaching for Alyssa and Susan for the first 9 months or so, and I shifted from the interim executive director role to the coach role, and they have continued to receive coaching along the way. Another thing that I think is just really important, and I'll sum up with this, is this culture of support, because we established in practical terms what it looks like to say we're all in this together, and to have clear accountability for performance, and also the generosity of no blame. If this thing doesn't work, it won't be because we all didn't give it our absolute best, and we all supported each other in it. And so leading from that, from that stance of we're all in this together, I think made a huge difference in this, because we literally bet the store.
Thank you so much, Gail. Yeah, I mean, that just so embodies that intersection of organizational and leadership transition, that you weren't willing to compromise on the organizational transition at all. No. And therefore, the leadership transition had to be very much in concert with it and in support of it. There were non-negotiables. Thank you so much. I'm going to move us ahead 2 slides, because you summarized the impacts beautifully, Gail, and invite our respondents in to this, the 4th part of our conversation today, next, where we have Rachel Gibson, who's a senior consultant at RAFA, Deb Linnell, senior program officer with the Van Buren Charitable Foundation, Marissa Torona, who's a program officer with the BUILD program at the Ford Foundation, and Linda Wood, senior director of Haas Leadership Initiatives, and get some perspective from, if you will, the third parties, the critical third parties of consultant and investor in organizations, what you're taking away from these stories. Rachel, let's start with you. Next slide. I know a lot of your work is around supporting long-time executive or founder transitions, and what are some of the things that stand out to you from a consultant skill set or mindset perspective?
Yeah, so I think for me, hearing the case studies and hearing examples of the key role that consultants play reaffirms my own belief on the impact of our work. And so consultants are really helping organizations think through what an organization truly needs in terms of how best to align this leadership opportunity with their own organizational values, right? Jenny mentioned with the children's in what they did around looking at onboarding as a year-long process. In many cases, consultants are reminding boards and staff that this is a major organizational shift, and transition doesn't happen or end when the person is seated in their new role, right? That this is an ongoing process, in many cases, sometimes up to 3 years. So giving organizations an understanding of the timing of this work is key. In my work, I work primarily with organizations led by founders and long-tenured executives, and those transitions are really tricky. So, Jean, at the top of the hour, you talked about organizations at this pivotal moment where they're expanding their own thinking about the kind of leadership that's needed to advance their mission. That's a tough conversation when they've had an executive, for instance, for the same executive for 20, 30 years. And so looking broadly at the work and trying to have a thoughtful and authentic and honest conversation around the leadership needs is oftentimes hard, because, there are sometimes individuals on the board who feel that having that conversation openly is somewhat a slight to the existing CEO who may be leaving, or that it somehow diminishes their impact. And so a consultant's role to navigate some of those emotions are key. I think consultants also bring a level of emotional intelligence to our process that is, in many cases, a make or break for these transitions. Transitions, where you have a long tenured executive, it's wrought with emotions and, in many cases, anxiety. And I think our role is to be that steady guiding force that really allows people to acknowledge the emotion, to say it's okay, but to figure out how best to move past it, to be able to then make decisions. And so our role is oftentimes to help people make that mental and emotional shift from the old to the new beginning, and that's the process. And I think we bring key skill sets around that. Finally, I would also just add, at least in my work, I am seeing, and as we talk about leadership ethos, we're at, usually during times of transition, organizations are really testing their values. So many value statements speak to inclusion, speaks to diversity, speaks to even equity. And we get to the place where we're working on a leadership transition. And as a consultant, you're oftentimes reminding them about those values that they spent a day working on in a retreat at some point, right? And so I hear often, we want somebody who may be a person of color, a younger leader, and it's our role as consultants to speak to boards and staff around how will you adjust practices so that you are inclusive of, younger leaders, or in some cases even older leaders, or leaders of color who may approach your work and the mission in a different way. So I think if I were to summarize, often we see consultants' roles as the tactics related to transition, the search process, moving the resumes. But I think at this point in our sector, we're playing a much broader and much more transformative role beyond some of these process things that folks oftentimes look to us for. So I think that's where I would put our role.
Thank you so much, Rachel. A lot to pick up on there in the Q&A. Deb, will you come on and unmute and join us? Deb Winnell is a Senior Program Officer with the Van Buren Charitable Foundation. Next slide. Hi, Deb. And I know that not only do you have that role, but you were also one of the researchers on the Leadership New England study recently, which taught us a lot about what EDs are inheriting, right, and what support they need. So welcome you, and invite you to talk, I think, largely through the connection to sustainability, the sustainability framework that Tom mentioned in his allied practices. You're muted still.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Just to give you a little context, I've been in the nonprofit field for about 38 years, and I've served on boards almost continuously that entire time. My great learning place is on being on boards of directors. None of them are the same. Been an executive director. I worked in a co-leadership model for 10 years in the 1980s, and I've also worked as a consultant, mostly as an evaluator and a researcher for foundations, very specifically on their capacity building programs and how effective they are or they're not. And as Jean said at the beginning, a lot has changed, in the sector, and this is a changing field as well. I'm now working at a small family foundation that funds the eastern state of Rhode Island, and I'm going to talk about how my life's learning is impacting the kind of capacity building programs we're laying on the ground here. But first I want to talk about that study that I did while I've been working here as this kind of a second job, really out of my fascination for this interest with Third Sector New England, the Leadership New England study. And I only want to talk about one recommendation from that study that has to do with sustainability. We drew these recommendations for over 1,000 respondents. And this was kind of a companion study to Compass Point's really great work with the Daring to Lead publications. I personally read comments from over 800 executive directors, and they had been asked what had they inherited when they took over the job. The good news is about 22%, or 1 in 5, of those 800 described inheriting a healthy, vibrant organization. And I want to have you hold that in the mind as the gold standard for succession planning, a lot like Hillside Inn described to us at the beginning. The bad news, and this is a very recent study, 19% said they inherited financially frail organizations, and 23% inherited organizations that needed a complete turnaround. So that's 2 out of 5 leaders taking a job, and I describe them as leading from behind, meaning they have to fix a lot of issues before they can get on to even ground and start to move a more strategic agenda. So I think it was Ruth or Jean or Tom talked in the beginning about this kind of cycle of thinking there's a magical person who can come in and help with these turnarounds. And the other recommendation is we have to stop doing that and look at succession planning much more within the framework of sustainability. And how do we do that, or what did we learn about that? Boards are critical. And you heard from some great board leaders today, and they were paying attention to their organizations, and it's really critical that people do that deeply. And I'm going to talk about some of the things they need to pay attention to. And again, not arrive at a transition and think there's going to be some magical executive director out there who can come, and do work that should have been happening for some years before the transition happened. Again, Hillside was a great example of this. And those things that the board should be paying attention to is that the leadership is being distributed across the organization. You're not just relying on one person. That means within the board, but also across the staff. And really going to reference work that Jean has been so expert in, and that's understanding your business model, the core strategies behind it that are meaningful to your constituents or your end users, the cost of getting those strategies on the ground, and the fundraising and resourcing for that. There's many domains to nonprofit excellence or having a high-performing nonprofit, but to really get there, the foundation is in sound programming married to understanding how you're going to resource that, or a business plan, and then sound financial management for getting there. And I really want to recommend that people look at Jean and Steve Zimmerman's book, The Sustainability Mindset, to really look at what I'm. If you get those foundations down, the other elements of nonprofit excellence, you can start to build on those, but those are really foundational. So as a funder, what are we doing about this? We actually don't fund executive transitions purely. We ask that our grantees add that to an annual request, and we'll look at that. We are much more interested in doing very long view capacity building work that gets at the sustainability questions. So very briefly, after the Great Recession, we started to work with grantees doing deep financial analysis and helping them learn how to be more strategic in their financial management, using Fiscal Management Associates out of New York as a great intermediary. And then after working with about 20 organizations 2 summers ago, we had Steve Zimmerman come out and speak to building sustainability, the type of triangle that I was talking to. And that was kind of a transition as we're now working with cohorts around building their business planning and the fundraising side of the organization. And again, this is all to strengthen them so that they're able to not only meet their mission and might be under the same executive director for 10 or 15 years, but to be able to not pass on a failing or weak organization to the next executive director, and to attract the right and best leadership. Rachel spoke so beautifully to the values proposition, so I'm not going to go into that, which is a piece of this work. So I'm more on the practical end of it. And really what we're about with this long-term and deep community-based capacity building is building a healthy ecosystem in the area we're in service to as a funder. And I'm going to re-quote what you said in the beginning, because we're after that same shift, the shift from competition to collaboration, and over single issue to intersectionality, and from scarcity to collective abundance. That's the big prize for us in the region we're in service to. Thanks.
Thank you, Deb, so much. I'm going to ask Linda Wood to join us to unmute and come on camera. And next slide, please. And are you unmuted, Linda?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. And I know that, in talking with you a little bit about this work, that it brought to mind Building Movement Project's recent research, the Race to Lead piece, which is another major contribution. Talk a little bit about some of the sense you were making of this.
Well, I think, first of all, thank you. I love the children. We have been one of those foundations that have invested for, 15 years and been really close to this whole practice of executive transition management for all the reasons that Tom spoke about at the beginning. And we also invest in organizations over time, typically within the context of movements, but in other situations. And so we have also supported a lot of executive transition and seen how we have to evolve the practice of executive transition management. And this whole question, I'm going to add to the chorus, I guess, about bringing more nuance to the practice, and specifically around diversity, equity, and inclusion as values and principles. And I guess I would just start with saying that it's a rare nonprofit that doesn't agree, or a rare nonprofit leader that doesn't agree that our nonprofit sector needs to reflect the diversity of our communities and the U.S. population, and it doesn't. And one of the studies that has just come out about how diversity hasn't changed that much, even though we have changed so much demographically as a country, is from Sean Breitfeld and Francis Kuhnreiter from Building Movement Project. And what they really wanted to dig into this question of why not. And what they found was that, it's not about skills of people of color, aspirations, preparations, experience, background. what it's about is implicit bias, and it's about hiring committees having implicit bias. It's about boards having implicit bias. And that should come as no surprise to us, because we know from recent science that this is, pretty widespread. We also know that, even the way that job qualifications are listed in position announcements also makes a difference. And so we've been asking, and I think we all need to be asking, and I certainly don't have all the answers, but how do we change not just executive transition management, but also strategy making and moving from values to strategy, as Rachel was talking about. And, many different practices need to be changed up, but specifically focused on executive transition. We have seen, for example, and this challenges best practice in executive transition, just like the Children's Inn challenge best practice, which is that, you should do a national search, or you should do a very wide search. And it turns out that a lot of talent of color, leaders of color that are very talented are at the second tier of organizations. And it just so happens when these national search or wide searches are conducted, it often favors white candidates because of all the different biases we have about what an effective leader it looks like and what kind of background they have. And so that's one we might, if we have a value of diversity, equity, inclusion, then that may be a practice that we would challenge. I've also seen how, again, and I think Rachel touched on this, that, folks have a kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion in some way value that might be baked into their organization, which sounds great at a retreat, but when you get to, well, how does that play out? The point of strategy making, which is an executive transition management principle that you should have strategic clarity, is also a really powerful place to bring that lens in and say, okay, well, how do our strategies change if we have those values? And then what does that mean for leadership on our board and also on our staff? So, I've seen it also be a powerful place there. So, I guess I would just end by saying, I think if we want greater diversity in our organizations, which most nonprofits say they want, then it starts with more equitable practices in organizations.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thanks. Marissa Torona from Ford Foundation, can you unmute and turn on your camera and join us?
Hi, everyone.
Welcome. And like so many people on this webinar, you have a lot of different hats you could put on. You've been a leadership developer and a senior staff person and obviously now in philanthropy. So next slide, please. I know that in particular, the leadership ethos idea and the notion of beliefs and practices resonated for you. Do you want to share a little your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is really building off what others have said, including Rachel and Linda. And if we're thinking about equity as a part of the evolving leadership ethos, we have to think about equity within the context of supporting leaders, teams, and institutions in being able to explore and navigate privilege, power, and oppression that exists also within their institutions. And so, one of the things I think that a lot of us have been thinking about is, what are the supports and tools that leaders and organizations need to really address power dynamics, privilege, and sort of just the relationships within an organization that allows them to then be impactful in many of the missions that they have, which is around addressing externally power, privilege, and oppression. Sort of recognizing those dynamics really opens up avenues for leaders and organizations to strive for justice, equity, and power sharing, and then also to create opportunities for all people and the communities that they serve to live full and rewarding lives. I mean, a couple of things I've been thinking about here is, from a funder perspective, what's our role in providing not just the resources, but the spaces for leaders to have the tools and practices to understand how power and privilege are linked to and impact both their organizational strategy and social change more broadly. what are the fora that we can offer to support leaders in identifying alternative behaviors that could be implemented to use power for culture and social change? And then again, what are the fora, resources, tools to support leaders and organizations to embrace culture and difference as sources of strength? So when I think of sort of leadership beliefs that need to be held by both an individual leader and sort of the collective leadership capacity in an organization, it really is this ability to examine how social location shapes power dynamics within organizations. And that includes an understanding of a couple of different things, right? And this is something that I name this as part of my own individual leadership practice, right? Is what does it mean to have power over? What does it mean to have power with? What does it mean to have power from within? What's my role as a positional leader wherever I sit within an organization to notice both the formal power networks in an organization and the informal power networks within an organization. And so because power is so relational and dynamic, leaders really have to examine their how their social location, right, influences their management and leadership practices within their organization. And so to the extent that we as funders and as consultants can really support, again, individual leaders and sort of collective leadership to understand first what their own power and privilege is, how they hold and how they use it within their organizations, then we are actually supporting leaders in their organizations, right, to shift collective assumptions they might hold in an organization that undergird their work, right, and then really undergird how their organizations see their work situated in the broader system. So that's one. The other one is slightly, I'm going to say it's slightly nerdy because this is the stuff that I like nerd out about. Can we say nerd? Is that okay, Jean, on this webinar? But it is something that, and I don't mean to, I say that as a joke, but I do think of this, building this particular practice around being able to hold complexity and practice emergence at the same time. In terms of part of this evolving ethos, and it very much relates to that quote that you have at the top, which came from our friends at MAG, I believe, about sort of the different ways that we're thinking, moving to collaboration, moving to sort of more intersectional thinking, moving to systems thinking. And, you know, as boundaries slip away from organizations, systems, and networks, and things become much more complex and interconnected, leaders really need to develop more complex and adaptive thinking abilities, right? And so we've all heard the term VUCA, that's been used a lot, but it's still useful here to think about how our world is unfortunately every day feeling more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I would add the words overwhelming and heartbreaking, right? And this is our milieu that we're going to be in for the foreseeable future. And so it was making me think about what are the ways that we can support leaderships who can sort of respond to complexity in a different way. And there's the framework that lots have talked about, the Cynefin framework. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. It's a Welsh word for habitat, but it sort of names different types of problems that are in front of a leader or a set of leaders. There's the simple problem, there's the complicated problem, there's the complex problem, and there's the chaotic problem, right? And we often talk about, as we have been talking about here today, that in leadership, sort of naming what the problem is sort of the most important thing to do. And when you have a complex problem in particular, you know, one thing for leaders to think about is what is the practice that I'm developing in response to complexity? Because complexity, and that is what the situation that we're in now, requires a whole different set of practices. And I just think that the practice of emergence is really instructive here. There are many who have taught on emergence. I turn to Margaret Wheatley's work quite often, right, when we think about emergence. And I'm thinking about, she offers a useful definition here. She's not the only one who talks about it, but I want to offer it here, is that in emergence, when we see emergence and emergent capacities show up in an organization, on a team, within a leader, those capacities are often, how should I describe it? They exert much more power than the sum of their parts. They also possess new capacities that didn't exist before. And they always surprise us by their appearance. So there's both the practice for a leader in the sort of evolving leadership ethos to develop their own emergence practice, right? And there's also a way for leaders to support the emergence kind of leadership of others, emergence capacity leadership of others. And when I think about those things that a leader can offer, it's around being able to name something when it shows up, being able to then connect people in the system around it, being able to nourish whatever those connections are, and then the ability to illuminate what's happening to others outside of the system. And to me, that's a part of being able to respond to the complexity around and then invite others in into solving it. So those are some of the things I was thinking about as we were talking about an evolving leadership ethos. So I'll just put those two right there.
Thank you so much, Marissa. And I want to turn this back over to Ruth now, Editor-in-Chief of the Nonprofit Quarterly, for her own questions or any questions she'd like to pose from the audience. I'm going to take myself off camera, I think, just so we don't run out of space.
Well, you guys have left me a hot 4 minutes.
Sorry.
But I have to say it was well worth it, because I thought everything led up to, in this webinar, led up to the things that Marissa said. And I want to, instead of asking the questions that were posed in our little panel, what I want to do is to try to incorporate some of those questions just in a summation of what we've heard today. Because I think that, you know, people, some of the questions that we got on the panel were still assuming that we were working from an ethos other than that which Marissa just described, which is we're working far more across boundaries in an emergent situation, and we have to have an emergent sense of what we need to do about that at all times. And that means engaging the whole of the system, the board and the staff, in the critical questions of an organization. That's what is the mark of a really excellent organization at this point. And so to allow your organization to not develop that kind of leadership, that ability to deal with complexity, essentially leaves the board at some point trying to do a lazy man's load at the point of transition, where the organization really should have been developing leadership and the ability to answer critical questions throughout its life, and to develop that, you know, ever more kind of broadly over time, even among its constituents. You know, it kind of defaults to, we need a leader to pull us out of whatever it is that we've created. The statistics that Deb cited are a good indication that that's what many organizations are doing. So what is so exciting about this new, about the new models that are being presented by Tom and by Jean, is that it brings these two things together: the need to create a sustainable organization that is updated constantly by the best thinking of those who are attached to that organization. There not being the boundaries that keep people with that keep intelligence at bay, and you know, keep cooperation at bay. And then second, that requires a really fairly participatory system where people are playing with the problems, not playing, but experimenting with those problems on a pretty constant basis. And so I appreciate the way Marissa really kind of ended this webinar, because I think it is that what we're looking at is a new kind of organization which needs a new kind of transition. And the transition is going to be less glass of cold water poured over you, and more a sense of a constant longing for the next plateau, the next horizon of the work that we're doing. And that's a very exciting place in which to be. And so with that, I do want to say one thing. There were a lot of questions about how to use an interim properly. And I think one of the ways that we could potentially use an interim properly is if there hasn't been the kind of leadership development that we would wish, so that we can actually look carefully at who we have already attached to the organization, that's something that an interim can be asked to help do over a period, you know, the period between one permanent and another, or one permanent and a different leadership setup. So with that, I want to thank every single one of our presenters today. You are all amazing. And thank all of those who stayed with us for this hour and a half. We're going to keep on after this topic. Make sure that if you didn't already log in your questions, that you log in questions that you would like us to answer as we move along on this topic. And again, Tom and Jean, thank you so much for conceptualizing all of this and putting it together.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everybody.